Roman currency poured into Kushan territory through ports in northern India, like Barakum, and above all, Baragaza, where the approach and anchorage were so treacherous that pilots were sent out to guide ships into port. Negotiating the approach to both ports was extremely dangerous for those who were inexperienced or were unfamiliar with the currents. Once on land, traders could find pepper and spices, as well as ivory and textiles, including both finished silks and silk yarn. It was an emporium that gathered goods from all over India, Central Asia, and China, and delivered extraordinary wealth to the Kushan, who controlled the oasis towns and caravan routes that linked them. The dominant position that the Kushan were able to establish meant that although goods were imported and exported from the Mediterranean into China in growing quantities, the Chinese themselves played little more role in trade with Rome via Indian Ocean. Only when the great general Ban Chao led a series of expeditions that took troops as far as the Caspian Sea at the end of the 1st century CE was an envoy dispatched to bring back more information about the tall and regularly featured population of the powerful empire in the west. Da Qin, or the Great Qin, as the Roman Empire was called, was reported to possess abundant supplies of gold, silver, and fine jewels. It was a source of many marvelous and rare objects. China's dealings with Persia became regular and intensive. Embassies were sent, for example, several times a year, notes one Chinese source, with at least 10 missions heading for Persia, and even in quieter periods, some 5 or 6 being dispatched west. Diplomatic envoys typically accompanied large caravans bringing goods for trading, which then returned home with products that were sought after at home, including Red Sea pearls, jade, lapis lazuli, and consumables such as onions, cucumbers, coriander, pomegranates, pistachios, and apricots. Highly desirable frankincense and myrrh, which in fact came from Yemen and Ethiopia, were known in China as Persia goods. As we are now, from one later source, know that the peaches of Samarkand were considered immensely valuable, as large as goose eggs and with a famously rich color to them. They were known in China as the golden peaches. Just as the Chinese had few direct dealings with Rome, the Mediterranean region's knowledge of the world beyond the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean was extremely limited, with a single Roman embassy attested as reaching the Emperor Huan around 166 CE. Rome's interest in and knowledge of the Far East was fleeting. Its eyes were fixed firmly on Persia. Of course, this was not just a rival and a competitor, but a possible target in its own right. Even as control was still being established over Egypt, authors like Virgil were talking excitedly of Roman influence being expanded. In a poem written to eulogize Augustus and his achievements, Horace wrote not of Roman domination of the Mediterranean, but of mastery of the entire world, including conquering the Indians and the Chinese. Doing so involved moving against Persia, and this became a common preoccupation of a succession of rulers. Grandiose plans were developed to push the empire's frontier as far as the mountain pass known as the Caspian Gates, deep inside Persian territory. Rome needed to control the heart of the world. In fact, efforts were made to turn these dreams into reality. In 113, the Emperor Trajan led an enormous expedition east in person, advancing rapidly through the Caucasus before swinging south to follow the course of the Euphrates River. He conquered Nisibis and Batne, and minted coins which proclaimed that Mesopotamia had been subjected to the power of the people of Rome. With resistance melting away, the emperor pressed on, splitting his forces into two. The great cities of the Persian Empire were taken in quick succession, with Idenistrae, Babylon, Seleucia, and Ctesiphon falling into Roman hands after a brilliant campaign that lasted a matter of months. Coins were immediately issued, struck with the uncompromising legend Persia Capta. Persia had been conquered. Trajan then marched down to Trax, modern Basra, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, arriving just as a merchant vessel set sail for India. He looked at the boat wistfully. If only he had been as young as Alexander the Great, he mused, he would have crossed to the Indus. With blueprints drawn up to establish new provinces of Assyria and Babylonia, Rome seemed poised to start a new chapter, one where the expansion of its frontiers would take it up to the Indus Valley and as far as the gateway to China. But Trajan's success proved short-lived, however. A fierce fight back was already underway in the cities of Mesopotamia before the emperor suffered a cerebral injury that killed him, while a revolt began in Judea and spread quickly, requiring urgent attention. Nevertheless, successive rulers kept their focus firmly pinned on Persia. It was here that military expenditure was concentrated, and where the frontier and what lay beyond was reported with intense interest in Rome. In sharp contrast with the empire's European provinces, emperors campaigned regularly in Asia, although not always successfully. In 260 CE, for example, the Emperor Valerian was humiliated after being taken prisoner and held in the abject form of slavery, used as a human footstool for the Persian ruler by bending his back to raise the king as he was about to mount his horse. His body was eventually flayed, and his skin, stripped from the flesh, was dyed with vermilion and placed in the temple of the gods of the barbarians, that the remembrance of a victory so signal might be perpetuated, and that this spectacle might always be exhibited for our ambassadors. He was stuffed so he could see the folly and shame of Rome. Ironically, it was precisely the growth and ambition of Rome that helped galvanize Persia itself. For one thing, the latter benefited greatly from the long-distance traffic between East and West, which also served to effect a shift in Persia's political and economic center of gravity away from the north. Previously, the priority had been to be located close to the steppes in order to negotiate with the nomad tribes for livestock and horses, and to supervise the diplomatic contracts necessary to avoid unwelcome attention and demands from the fearsome peoples on the steppes. This was why oasis towns like Nisa, Abivard, and Dara had become important, home to magnificent royal palaces. With central coffers boosted from tax and transit fees drawn from growing local and long-distance trade, major infrastructure projects were now embarked on. These included the transformation of Ctesiphon on the eastern bank of the Tigris in central Mesopotamia into a worthy new capital city, and also heavy investment in ports such as Characine on the Gulf to handle increasing volumes of maritime traffic, in not all of which, though, was destined for Rome. A thriving trade had built up in a glazed pottery from Persia, heading to both India and Sri Lanka during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. But the most significant effect of Rome's military attention was that it prompted a political revolution. Faced with the intense pressure from its neighbor, Persia underwent a major transformation. A new ruling dynasty, the Sassanians, emerged around 220 CE, offering a strident new vision, one which required the removal of authority from provincial governors who had become independent in all but name, and the concentration of power at the center. A series of administrative reforms saw a tightening of control over almost every aspect of the state. Accountability was prioritized, with Persian officials issued with seals to record their decisions, to allow responsibility to be tracked, and to ensure the accurate reporting of information. Many thousand of seals have survived to show just how far this reorganization went. Merchants and markets found themselves being regulated, with one source recording how producers and traders, many arranged into guilds, were allocated specific areas in bazaars. This made it easier for inspectors to ensure that quality and quantity standards were met, and above all, to collect tax duties efficiently. The focus of the urban environment, the location for most commercial exchange, extended to improving water supply systems, which in some cases were extended to several miles to increase available resources and provide scope for further urban growth. Countless new towns were founded, with a later Persian text that draws on contemporary material attesting to a boom in urban development throughout Central Asia, the Iranian Plateau, Mesopotamia, and the Near East. Large-scale irrigation programs in Khuzestan and Iraq were undertaken as part of a deliberate attempt to boost agricultural production, which must also have had the effect of bringing down food prices. Archaeological finds show that packages were inspected prior to export, while textual material attests to copies of contracts being stamped and stored at registry offices. The incorporation of towns and territories that had been subject to the Kushan for the best part of 2 centuries back into Persia proper also allowed for an intensification of trade with the East. As Persia soared to Rome began to teeter. The Sasanians were not the only problem, for by 300 CE, the full length of the empire's eastern border that ran from the North Sea to the Black Sea, from the Caucasus through to the southern tip of Yemen, was under pressure. The entire empire had been built on expansion and was protected by a well-drilled military. As territorial growth tailed off, however, the result of reaching the natural boundaries of the Rhine and Danube rivers and the Taurus and anti-Taurus mountain ranges in eastern Asia Minor, Rome became a classic victim of its own success. It was now itself a target for those living beyond its borders. Desperate steps were taken to try to correct a worrying imbalance between dwindling tax revenues and the burgeoning costs of defending the frontiers. To inevitable outcry, one commentator lamented that the Emperor Diocletian, who tried to deal with the fiscal deficit aggressively, created problems rather than solving them, and in his greed and anxiety, he turned the whole world upside down. A root and branch review of the empire's assets was conducted, the prelude to the overhaul of the tax system. Officials were dispatched to all corners, with assessors turning up unannounced to count every single vine and every single fruit tree, with the aim of raising imperial revenues. An empire-wide edict was issued setting the prices for staple goods as well as for luxury imports, like sesame seed, cumin, horseradish, and cinnamon. A fragment of this order recently discovered in Bodrum shows how far the state was trying to reach. No fewer than 26 types of footwear, from gilded women's sandals to purple low-rise Babylonian-style shoes, had a price ceiling set on them by Rome's tax inspectors. In the event, the strain of trying to reestablish the empire wore Diocletian out, and he retired to the coast of Croatia to turn his attention to matters that were more enjoyable than affairs of the state. "I wish you would come to Salona," he wrote to one of his former colleagues, "and see the cabbages I have planted myself. They were so impressive," he went on, "that one could never be tempted by the prospect of power ever again." Where Augustus had portrayed himself as a soldier in a famous and magnificent statue found at the Prima Porta on the outskirts of Rome, Diocletian preferred to present himself as a farmer. This summed up how Rome's ambitions had changed over the course of 300 years, from contemplating expansion to India to contemplating the cultivation of prize-winning vegetables. As the Romans looked on nervously, a mighty storm cloud was gathering. It was the Emperor Constantine who took action. The son of one of the leading men in the empire, he was ambitious and capable, with a knack for finding himself in the right place at the right time. He had a vision of what was needed for Rome that was as clear as it was startling. The empire needed strong leadership. That was much obvious to everyone, but he had a more radical plan than simply concentrating power in his own hands. To build a new city, a new pearl on the string, linking the Mediterranean with the East. The location he chose fittingly was the point where Europe and Asia meet. There had been long rumors of rulers of Rome contemplating moving the seat of imperial power. According to one Roman author, Julius Caesar considered making either Alexandria or the site of ancient Troy in Asia Minor the capital, as they were better located to govern where Rome's interests lay. At the start of the 4th century CE, this finally happened, with a magnificent city established at the crossroads of Europe and Asia that was a statement of where the empire's focus was fixed. A splendid new metropolis was built on the site of the old town of Byzantion, on the banks of the Bosporus, which in time came not only to rival Rome, but to surpass it. Huge palaces were built, as was a hippodrome for chariot racing. In the center of the city, an enormous column was set up, carved from a single massive porphyry block, with a statue of the emperor on the top looking down. The new city was called New Rome, although it quickly came to be known as the city of its founder, Constantinople. Of course, now it's called Istanbul, but the once famous ancient city of Byzantium. Parallel institutions were set up to mirror those of the mother city, including a senate whose members were sneered at by some as the new riches, the sons of coppersmiths, bath attendants, sausage makers, and the like. Constantinople was to become the largest and most important city in the Mediterranean, far eclipsing its peers in size, influence, and importance. Although many modern scholars strongly repudiate the idea that Constantine intended the city to be a new imperial capital, the lavish resources spent on its construction tell their own story. Constantinople was situated in a commanding position for other sensitive routes, not least maritime traffic in and out of the Black Sea, and also as a listening point for developments to the east and also to the north. In the Balkans and toward the plains of Pannonia, where trouble was brewing. For the vast majority of the population in classical antiquity, horizons were decidedly local, but with trade and interaction between people being carried out over short distances as well. Nevertheless, the webs of communities wove into each other to create a world that was complex, where tastes and ideas were shaped by products, artistic principles, and influences thousands of miles apart. 2 millennia ago, silks made by hand in China were being worn by the rich and powerful in Carthage and other cities in the Mediterranean, while pottery manufactured in southern France could be found in England and in the Persian Gulf. Spices and condiments grown in India were being used in the kitchens of Xinjiang as they were in those of Rome. Buildings in northern Afghanistan carried inscriptions in Greek, while horses from Central Asia were being ridden proudly thousands of miles away to the east. We can imagine the life of a gold coin 2 millennia ago, struck perhaps in a provincial mint and used by a young soldier as part of his pay to buy goods on the northern frontier in England, and finding its way back to Rome in the coffers of an imperial office sent to collect taxes, before passing into the hands of a trader heading east, and then being used to pay for produce bought from traders who had come to sell their provisions at Baragaza. There it was admired and presented to leaders in the Hindu Kush, who marveled at its design, shape, and size, and then gave it over to be copied by an engraver, himself perhaps from Rome, perhaps from Persia, or from India or China, or perhaps even someone local who had been taught the skills of striking. This was a world that was connected, complex, and hungry for exchange. It is easy to mold into the past a shape that we find convenient and accessible, but the ancient world was much more sophisticated and interlinked than we sometimes like to think. Seeing Rome as the progenitor of Western Europe overlooks the fact that it consistently looked to and in many ways was shaped by influences from the East and from outside its borders. The world of antiquity was very much a precursor of the world as we see it today. Vibrant, competitive, efficient, and energetic, unlike the lethargic times of the medieval ages. It was a belt of towns which formed a chain spanning all of Asia. The West had begun to look east, and the East had begun to look west. Together with increasing traffic connecting India with the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, the ancient Silk Roads of antiquity were coursing with life. Rome's eyes had been fixed on Asia from the moment it transformed itself from a republic into an empire. And so too, it turned out, had its soul, for Constantine and the Roman Empire had found God. as you remember, that Constantine made Christianity legal and also made it the religion of the entire empire. And of course, the new faith was from the east as well. Surprisingly, it came not from Persia or from India, but from an unpromising province where 3 centuries earlier Pontius Pilate had found infamy as governor. Christianity was about to fan out in all directions. And then we'll see later as well the rise of Islam.